If I did make the decision to do that, I don't know if I don't know, and nothing like talking about your daughter will get you emotional.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could live in that world with knowing that even though the whole world was saved because of the sacrifice of my daughter, I don't know if I could live in that world. And yet you read that it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Again, how do you boil that down? Hello and welcome back to In Between Sundays with Marco. I'm glad you are here. Today we've got a podcast with a preacher by the name of Jeff Jenkins. He is someone that I love and respect very much. This is going to be the first in a series that we'll do here and there where I'm going to have a preacher come in and actually teach me. A lot of the podcasts I do are me teaching things or explaining things, responding to things, whatever they might be. But I also wanted to use the podcast as an opportunity to learn some things. Transparently, I've been studying through grace and trying to get deeper with it. And I really just wanted to know in some areas if I was on the right track or not. So I thought I'd just have him on. And these are the kinds of conversations I would, have over the phone with a preacher like him or someone else. And I thought, well, you might want to be part of that conversation. You might have these questions too. You might want to get deeper on this. And so I thought, let's just do that together. I'm so blessed to have these amazing conversations with preachers that I know, that I love, that I respect. And I know that some people would love to even just be a fly on the wall in that kind of a conversation, to be able to listen in on that. And I don't always get to do that. So I thought, again, maybe I'll just have the conversation and you can see it too. Jeff is someone who's been doing ministry for a very long time, about 50 years. He has a lot to offer, a lot to say. And so I loved our conversation very much. I'm sure you will too. Before we get into the video though, please be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel. If you got a comment or a question, leave a comment below. I'd love to hear from you. Whatever you got to say, I'm here for it. So God bless you. Let's get into the conversation.
Follow you right along.
Ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we'll get right into it then. I'm here today with Jeff Jenkins. He is a child of God who wears many, many hats, has worn many, many hats. To me though, because I don't know all the hats, I know a lot of them, but to me, foremost, he is a gospel preacher who invests in other ministers through various means. The Jenkins Institute, the preachers conferences like the Better Conference, which I've been to, books as well. There's this awesome book that I just mentioned right now, Don't Quit on a Monday, that he co-wrote with his brother Dale Jenkins. But if you're really cool, you have Don't Quit on a Tuesday. That's what all the really cool people have. And I have Don't Quit on a Tuesday. And it's a really uplifting book. If you're a preacher watching this, you better get both of those books. Is there a Don't Quit on a Wednesday yet?
Marco, there is now Don't Quit on a Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Are you
Saturday,
serious?
Sunday. So there are
That is awesome.
books. Yeah.
Wow.
I'll send you the rest of them.
Please do. Wow, I didn't know. I thought only the cool guys had Tuesday. I didn't know there was Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Wow, that is awesome. Yeah, I've known some preachers who have quit on a Sunday. Some even mid-sermon, in the moment they decided to do that. And it's not always the recommendable thing. I think sometimes discouragement can seep in a little bit. And that's kind of the purpose of those books, right? Discouragement can seep in on those days of the week. And sometimes, and I love the books for that reason. They're so encouraging and uplifting. But again, thank you for being here. You're doing okay?
Hey, Marco, it's great to be with you today. This is
Awesome.
A lot of fun. It's good to see you. And I mentioned you earlier, I'm coming to you folks today from one of the branch offices of the Jenkins Institute, otherwise known as Chick-fil-A. We land wherever there is one and go to it directly.
Yeah.
But, so there might be some background noise. I apologize for that, but I'm glad to be with you. Appreciate what you're doing, Marco.
Oh, I absolutely appreciate it. Now, are you like in Texas right now? Are you somewhere out of town? Are you?
I got into Texas a little after midnight last night, or got back into Dallas. I just finished a gospel meeting down in Giddings, Texas, over the weekend, and had a great weekend there.
Wow.
Met with preachers Saturday morning for breakfast and preached Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. It was a great meeting, and I head out on Thursday morning for Alabama, where we'll be doing another workshop for preachers, and I'll be preaching over in Alabama on Sunday. So,
wow. Busy.
in Dallas for a couple of days.
Okay. Wow. Well, thank you for taking the time to do this. I really, really appreciate it.
Well, glad and honored.
Today, Jeff is here to teach me about grace. And a big part of this podcast was I wanted to do this. I wanted to have preachers on that I admire, that I look up to, ones who have been studying for longer than I have been alive, maybe even longer than my parents. And I mean that very respectfully, just as a statement of fact.
That puts it in perspective, Marco. Yeah. And I don't know if I'm going to teach you anything, Marco. I think you know a great deal, but I'm glad to discuss it with you.
Well, I was going to say, I have some questions, and I've always known Jeff to be the man with all the answers. Is that a pretty fair characterization?
No, sir. That's not fair at all.
Okay.
I always have an answer, but it's not always the right one.
Well, the first hard-hitting question, and this is real serious. I asked a preacher friend. I said, "Hey, I'm going to talk to Jeff about grace, and do you have any? These are the questions I'm going to ask him. Do you have any you want to add, or any you think would be good?" And he said, "Ask him this." So I am going to ask you this: do you say grace before or after the chips and salsa? Now, I it's obviously a joking question, but I need to know what kind of preacher you are, because there are some preachers. These are the two schools of thought. Do you need to pray to cover the chips and salsa, or are they covered in prospect of the prayer that will take place before the entrees come?
Marco, the truth about it is, I say grace before, during, and after the chips and salsa.
Oh, wow! I didn't see that coming. That's next level.
Yes. I always try to express thanks to God for what we're going to have in a meal.
Wow.
And then sometimes, after to thank God for what He's blessed us with.
That is awesome.
And by the way, we live in a world where I just got back from not too long ago. I spent a week or so in Cambodia, and they didn't have chips and salsa there. So I say this partially joking that they're missing out on one of God's greatest gifts. But the truth is, we live in a country, and we're blessed by God to have gifts from God that are gifts of God's grace that many people throughout our world do not have. And we should never lose that kind of perspective of how blessed we are. Right.
Yeah. I was
in Cambodia. I was having withdrawal symptoms. But
yeah. Well, I hope you got your fix when you came back. I decided I'd give you grace for whatever answer you had. I feared that you would have the wrong answer, but your answer was actually better than mine. So,
what was your answer?
Well, see, if I'm gonna have lunch with someone that I've never had lunch with before, a Christian or something, I wait and see what they do. If they start to snack on some chips before the prayer, then I'll snack on some chips too. But if they wait, then I'll wait too. And sometimes if they wait long enough, I'll go, "Hey, I'll just say a prayer right now, so we can get to this." But all during the meal is, again, that's why I have you on the podcast. That's next level stuff. I got to think about that.
Sometimes it depends on what your perspective is. Some people look at chips and salsa not as the main course. If you look at it as the main course, then
yeah, exactly. Or I know some people that just go, "We're just going to go have some dessert somewhere." Do you pray for that too? I mean, a lot of times they do, a lot of times they don't, but I guess it's not a bad idea to just pray for all of it all the time. That's a good habit to have. Yeah. All right. Well, now actually getting into grace itself. I have this experience, and again, I'm being really transparent here, and it's something that I'm working on doing more as a preacher. And you know very well, preachers can sometimes put up a facade to protect themselves, to protect whatever it might be, even ego sometimes, or their credibility. They fear that they'll lose credibility. And so I really am working on taking down this facade that I might have inadvertently put up in my life. And that's a big reason why I have you here, and why I want to have other ministers as well to teach me about these things. My experience regarding grace and my study of grace has been one throughout the years, especially in the early years of my time studying the Bible as a Christian. I haven't been a Christian too long, 10 years. But my experience regarding grace has been one of underemphasis or oversimplification due to I have roots in denominationalism, and so a lot of the time, whenever I've talked about grace, is okay, we're saved by grace, and then now all we're going to do is talk about what it takes to get grace, and the debate in the religious world, all the false doctrines that are out there. What I try to avoid every time I talk about grace, my mind just goes to, you have to mention that you have to deal with the false doctrine that grace means nothing that you do matters, your actions, that God doesn't care about your behavior at all in your life, and that was the problem that I was mixed in with for a long time, that whenever I thought about grace, I only just went to that lane, that kind of a lane. Have you found that has been the case in other people's lives as well, just in your time as a minister? Like, have you seen that kind of a pattern in other Christians? Is it more rare? I really am curious about that.
So, Marco, I think from my experience, there who have considered grace that way and who have come to that kind of place with grace in their lives, that they feel, it's almost like they feel guilty in their minds for believing in grace or for accepting, explain why some of those false teachings are true. It seems to me there's two extremes, though. There's one extreme that says we should never talk about grace, and I've heard preachers say that they, in their past, they didn't talk about grace, and I've heard some say they grew up not hearing about grace. And when I hear that statement, I think how unfortunate that is. That was not the way I was raised. I grew up in Alabama, and there was a man there by the name of Franklin Camp. Some of the preachers will know him. He was a kind of a well-known student of Scripture, and particularly the Old Testament in Alabama. And he talked about grace extensively. And I took classes that he taught as a teenager in high school. There were college level classes. And then in my own life, my father was a preacher, and he talked of grace often. And so when I hear somebody say, I grew up not hearing about grace, the Church of Christ didn't teach about grace, I think that was not my perspective. That was not the way I remember it. And I think that's unfortunate that people have that memory. Sometimes I wonder if preachers have heard that and they kind of parrot that because that they don't remember what their experience was, and they assume. I get kind of angry when I hear somebody say that in the past the Church of Christ never taught about grace, and the Church of Christ didn't believe in grace, and those in our preachers, because I know that's not true.
Yeah.
And I feel sorry for somebody that didn't have that they were not taught that way in their younger years. So one extreme is to and I'm certain that's true, that some didn't hear about grace. And so that's one extreme. Let's don't talk about it, because we don't want to handle all of those false teachings, those things you mentioned. And we don't want to have to deal with what people say about us if we say something like that. But the other extreme is that grace becomes almost like a god to people. It's you do have that extreme where some people say that God is a God. Therefore, we have a license to do whatever we want to do because God is such a great God of grace. And that's exactly what Paul was writing about in Romans chapter 6, when he apparently had received some conversation from people in Rome who were saying, because of God's grace, we have a license to live however we want to live. And Paul's statement was, because of grace, do we get to live however we want to live? And then he said, God forbid, that it should never be that way. So some people use grace as a license to do whatever they want to do and live the way they want to live, and say, well, God's grace is going to take care of that, so I don't have to worry about that.
Yeah.
I think both of those extremes are extremely dangerous, not only to our lives personally as individual Christians, but to the kingdom as a whole. And so we've got to. And there are numerous passages that explain the fact that we're saved by God's grace, and one of my favorite passages is 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 18, where Paul had just said in verse 17 old things have passed away. Behold, all things become new. And then Paul makes a statement at the beginning of verse 18 that I think we miss a lot of times. He says at the beginning of verse 18, all these things are from God, or some of the translations say all these things are of God.
Mm-hmm.
And what he's talking about there is what he has just mentioned in verse 17. And so Paul says everything that has anything to do with our salvation or becoming a new creature came from God. And in my mind, that means God initiated it, God planned it, God schemed it, God dreamed it up, however you want to say that. There's no way that we could figure out a way to save ourselves. We don't have enough knowledge or wisdom or education or creativity. And we don't have to, because God is the one who did that. Now, of course, God has a pattern and a plan and all of that for our lives. But if we ever forget that it began with God, and God is the one who initiated it, and God made it possible, even according to Paul, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for the ungodly, even when we didn't deserve it. And that's kind of the most basic definition of grace. If we ever forget that, we're in deep trouble.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask you. Before I get into that, I remember once some years back, I had done like a 3-part series of lessons on what grace is, and I preached that, and in part was because in my experience, again, I'd just been veering off into only thinking about grace in terms of denominational doctrines, and I preached like a 3-part sermon on just pure grace and what grace is, and as much as I understood at the time how much it works in our lives. And I remember like 2 weeks later, there was a much older Christian who, I think he was getting a devotional, and he went up there and he was, as an illustration, saying, there's some things in the Church of Christ we just don't talk about. And he said, when's the last time you heard a sermon on grace? When's the last time you heard a sermon on grace? And I thought to myself, he was there for all 3 of those sermons, but it's clear that he obviously wasn't being dishonest. He was just so used to saying that all throughout the years that even when he had heard sermons on grace, it didn't really reach the part of his brain that had that line logged away that he's obviously been using for so long. And it's a really big statement towards those extremes that you're talking about, that we could even ignore the stuff that we have heard because we're convincing ourselves that we never do hear it.
And Marco, I love preachers, and I want to be careful about this, but sometimes I do think that preachers, if we're not careful, we end up parroting what we've heard somebody else say, whether that was our experience or not, sometimes because we think that's the kind of the in thing to say, the popular thing to say, and people will listen to us more if we'll make that kind of comment. And I know personally some preachers, I've heard them say, I never heard about grace when I was growing up. And I know that's not true.
Yeah.
Because I know some of them, I know where they came from. I know who their preachers were. I know what kind of people, and they might have been, I'm not saying they're dishonest. I hope they're not, but they may have been like that man you were talking about. They just heard that so much that's kind of what's ingrained in their mind. So they
yeah. I know there's no shortage of preachers who have preached something, and then a member comes up to them a couple weeks later and goes, "Hey, I'd love to hear a sermon about this." And you go, "I just preached that," but not everyone remembers that type of stuff.
So I'd just say that we have to be we have to consider the possibility that there are those 2 extremes out there, and we don't want to fall into put ourselves in a category just because we think it's a popular thing to do, to be a part of either one of those, or the idea that we don't want to talk about grace, and some people believe that some have the wrong view of grace. We don't want to be a part of that group just because we're afraid. For instance, we're afraid. A lot of people live their life and make their decisions based on fear, and the fear is what other people will think about them, or what other people say about them.
As a preacher now, asking you this question from a preacher, from a preaching perspective, maybe you've done both of these things, maybe one more than the other, so that's why I asked this. In your time, whenever you preached and you preach about grace, did you prefer to, when you do you prefer to preach like whole sermons about grace, make whole points about grace, or do you try to make that permeate the overall sermons that you preach, or the majority of sermons that you preach? For example, I heard
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Well, just to help illustrate what I'm saying here, I heard Ed Wharton once say it this way. He said, "You need to preach about grace, and especially when it comes to the relationship with law keeping and things like that." He said, "Preach about it on a Sunday morning, and then the very next Sunday, preach about it again, but hit a different part of the podium so they don't know you're preaching the same thing." And so basically what he says is make it permeate every single sermon that you preach in some way. Is that kind of the way you did it, or did you just give dedicated time to it in a more explicit and direct way, or a little bit of
So
both?
let me say that while we're being transparent, in my early years of preaching, and um, Marco, this year, uh, it was 50 years ago when I started preaching. Counting, I mean, just I didn't preach every week, but when I was started preaching on weekends at a lot of churches, and then through high school and college. So I'm 50 years, and particularly after my college years, probably I would take grace and make that a topic that needed a um, let's do a series on grace. Let's do a series on love. Let's do a series on grace. Let's do a series on fundamentals. Let's do a series on worship. Let's do a series on family. And that was just kind of the way I thought. And part of that was probably a little bit of immaturity, and part of that was probably that I was programmed to do that, preaching series. I didn't preach as much expository back in those days, and part of that was survival, because I didn't have the years of study and the knowledge, and I was just trying to finish, trying to get the material. But somewhere along the line, there are two things that hit me that I had not done early in my preaching life. One is I did not think that I talked about grace or mentioned grace, or at least the concept of it in every lesson. And I didn't talk about what I believe now to be our purpose in life, and that is to glorify God. If somebody would have asked me uh, 40 years ago, what do you believe your purpose in life is? I probably would have said to go to heaven and take as many people with me as I could. Um, I think that's my mission. But somewhere along the line, I've come to believe that my purpose in life is to glorify God.
Mm-hmm.
And so in every lesson, probably over the past 20, 25 years, I would say that the thought of grace is mentioned, or at least alluded to. And still there are times that I've done series of sermons on grace as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you could make that same point when it comes to this statement sometimes, and I don't fault Christians for thinking about it this way. I do think, though, that there is a better way to think about it, with the emphasis on glorifying God as for our reason for being here. A lot of the times Christians say this, and again, understandably so, we're here so that we can make it to heaven. Everything we do is about getting to heaven and getting to heaven, and I want to get to heaven, they want to get to heaven too, but even our more basic purpose than that is glorifying God, and a byproduct of it is heaven.
Yes,
And that was something, again, there's kind of like this Christian speak that we use, and again, there is nothing wrong with wanting to go to heaven. I live for that in so many ways, but on the most basic fundamental level, that is a byproduct of what I actually do live for. It's a blessing that comes from, it's an outgrowth of what I'm really here for, and it's I belong in this world, or I live in this world because I belong to God, and I'm dedicated to His glory. All things were made by Him and for Him, like in Colossians 1:16.
and if we believe that, if we learn to live according to that, it's one thing to say, yeah, we're supposed to glorify God in all we do. Well, what does that mean? We
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
understand what it means to live a life that glorifies God, and if we do that, we will go to heaven. So not only will we go to heaven, but we'll take other people to heaven with us, and we'll influence other people. And our lives I think our lives and our minds and our hearts will be more fulfilled if I really figure out that can become a trite statement, almost like being saved by grace. We're saved by grace. Well, what does that mean? What all of that entailed? And again, it's not so much of I want to explain that away, but to make the statement and to understand what the statement means, and then to put it to practice in my life is a different thing.
Yes. With that in mind, I have, again, a big reason why I wanted to talk with you about this is I have struggled. I've been preaching on grace, especially very recently here at the church in Seagoville, and I know I've grown a lot in my Bible, but my understanding of the Bible's teaching on grace, God's wisdom on grace, but I still feel this struggle that I have to. I want to use the language boil it down, or to reduce it to a statement or a couple of statements to describe grace and its role in my life. I think I can do it decently well, but I need so many words to do it.
A lot of people want to take grace and define it with a term, or define it with a sentence, or uh, define it with an acronym. You've heard God's riches at Christ's expense, and that's
Yeah.
sounds a little bit flowery, but what in the world does that mean?
Yeah.
Don't tell me that that's the definition of grace. Explain to me what it is. And um, while I think we need to help people have an understanding of a definition of grace, it's not so much about understanding a definition, but it's living a life that is a response to grace, and a life that is filled with grace, a life that extends grace, and all of that is, if we can get to that point, nothing wrong with giving a definition. I grew up going to a Christian camp, and we would be given these terms and then given the definition, and we had to be able to learn the term. And I can vividly remember as a 9-year-old kid learning all of these terms and grace, and the definition of grace was God's unmerited favor. And so I said all my life, grace. Well, what does that mean? And as you study the scriptures, what the scriptures do is the scriptures explain to us what that concept means in detail. The scriptures allude to those kind of statements without even mentioning grace. I think about passages like James 1:17 that we quote a lot. Every good gift and every perfect gift comes from above. And so what is that? Well, that's grace right there. That anything that is good in this world is good because God is good. It's here because of God. And every blessing that we have in our life, and Ephesians 1:3, all of our spiritual blessings that we have, those are all acts of God's grace to us. And I don't think we do justice to the idea of grace if we just give a definition without giving the biblical insight into what it means, and what it does, and what it is to us.
Well, I love that point, because the reason why I asked that, or I mentioned that to you, is because I started to have this internal question within me, where I know that we have that Christian glossary where we go, grace is unmerited favor, mercy is when you don't get what you do deserve. And things like that. We have all those. I could ask, from the pulpit, and I've done this during Bible classes and things like that. I'll ask the room of the members and say, what is this? And it's the Christian glossary. And again, there's a function for that. There's a use for it, and there's a good place for it. But I started to think to myself, I had it boiled down to unmerited favor for so long, but when I tried to really preach about it, I struggled to describe something that I so easily defined. And so I thought, is it that I'm so ignorant, or is it just that grace is so unsearchably big that to try to boil that down is crazy? I mean, if someone, and this has been the case for a long time, if someone were to ask me, boil down the love of God to a statement, what do you mean? I don't even understand it. And in this real way, I don't understand the love of God, how He could still love me. I don't see myself being capable of that love for anyone or anything, let alone even myself. At the end of the day, even if self-preservation was all I am, I don't even think I could still love myself. And God still loves me after all the wrongs I've done directly against Him. And so I don't know how to boil down love. And the more I started to study grace, I started to think maybe I can't boil it down, because how do you boil down something as big as that? Does that kind of make sense?
I had in my mind a while ago, I was going to mention that and failed to, but one of the reasons that, you talk about doing a 3-lesson series on grace. Well, grace is a huge topic.
Yeah.
I mean, how you can't do justice even in 3 lessons to the idea of grace, and grace it's like you've heard somebody say, or you've probably said this before, that Jesus is the key to every book in the Bible.
Hmm.
And seen that list of who Jesus is in every book. Well, grace is on every page of Scripture. It's on every page of Scripture from beginning to end. When God said to Adam and Eve, "Here's a garden that I've created for you to live in, a perfect paradise, and you have all of this food that is free, and you don't have to do anything to pay me for this food." From beginning to end, it's all about God's grace, and I really believe that God's grace can be seen in every page of the Bible, even when. Why did God save the world through Noah? It wasn't because Noah was such a perfect man, but uh, but he found grace. God found grace
Hmm.
and gave it to Noah, and it was I'm going to let you live. Uh, I want the world to survive. I want humankind to survive, and I'm going to let you live, not because you're perfect, but because I'm a God of grace. And I mentioned earlier that passage in Romans 5 that we ought to have that somehow engraved in our heart, that God demonstrated his love for us, that even while we're sinners, Christ didn't die for us because we deserved him to die. Christ didn't die for us because we had done something worthy of it. Christ didn't die for us because we were good, but even while we're sinners. And, I have a son, I have one son, and there's a lot of people I love in the world, but there's nobody I would give up my son for. Now, of course, there have been times I wanted to kill him, when he was, but, but, but I wouldn't give him up for anything. And if we could somehow, if we could, if you could meditate almost on that concept, who would do that? Who has done that? Who would be willing to do that for other people, and particularly for other people who had done them wrong and who have mistreated them and who have sinned against them? So I really do think grace is on every page of Scripture.
Well, with that, I was in a recent time I was studying for a sermon. I came across this verse that I've read Isaiah 53 a million times in talking about the death of Jesus and prophecy about Jesus and things like that. And I looked at verse 10, that line that says, "Yet it pleased the Lord to bruise him," and I was confounded about what that meant, because I thought to myself, if I have a daughter who's 14 months old, and then another one who's about to be born, Lord willing, any day now. And I thought, if someone were to say, "Would you give up your daughter to save 10 people's lives, 100 people's lives?" If they told me, "Would you give up your daughter to save the whole world from dying, for whatever the situation is, to save the whole world," I still don't think I could do that. I still don't think I can do that. And if I did do that, which is one of the most horrible things I can think about with my human brain, if I did make the decision to do that, I don't know. And nothing like talking about your daughter will get you emotional.
Yeah.
I don't know if I could live in that world with knowing that, even though the whole world was saved because of the sacrifice of my daughter, I don't know if I could live in that world. And yet, you read that it pleased the Lord to bruise him. Again, how do you boil that down? How do you reduce that?
Imagine doing what you said. Imagine giving up your daughter for the whole world, and then you see people every day, people who are unkind to you, people who mistreat you, people who ignore you, people who act like they don't care anything about you. And because we're human, my thought would always be, you have no idea what I've done for you. You don't have any concept of what I gave up for you, and you're going to treat me that way. Well, God never does that. And the fact is, that statement in Isaiah 53, that was said before the event occurred. It pleased God. It pleased him already, knowing in what Isaiah write, that 750 years before Jesus was crucified, God knowing that was what was going to happen, but it pleased him and he knew that people would ignore him and mock him and forget about him and mistreat him and abuse him and misuse him, but he did it anyway, and it still pleased him to do that. That's one of those things that that are out of my ability to comprehend. I cannot comprehend. And all I know that's because we're human and we can't think the way God thinks, but I can't comprehend in my wildest imagination knowing that I would do something like that and it would please me to do that for other people. I'm like you, I couldn't exist in a world like that.
It's a clear testament to the complete holiness of God, that he is so far above and superior in every single way to me. And I can't think about grace now without thinking about that. I used to just say, think about grace in terms of God did this for me and I don't deserve it. And now I realize that grace is, would you agree with this? Grace is far more extreme than just God gave me something I don't deserve. I've been reading this book. I don't know if you've ever read this book before, by Milton Jones, Grace, The Heart of the Fire. But he gives this example where he asked his 4-year-old son, who grew up going to church services. I think he was a preacher, and he said, he asked him, "Hey, what would you say grace is?" I think he was looking for a funny anecdote for a sermon, and his son said, "Well, I want this toy, and I'm 4 years old. I can't afford it. So if you bought it for me, it would be grace." And it was very profound for a 4-year-old, most certainly. And the way I kind of thought about grace was that, well, I don't have the money to purchase my salvation, my right standing with God, and God in his grace has still offered that to me anyway. But I think and I want to know if you agree with this or not. It seems to me it's more extreme than that it's not just that I don't deserve it. In a real sense, it's like I'm the last person who could ever deserve it, as a person who has wronged God so much. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I agree with that completely. And Paul said, "I'm the least of all."
Yeah.
If and I don't doubt that Paul really believed that, or he really meant that in his heart. But that's really the way we all should think. And it's not just about. Sometimes we think about God saved the world, he loved the world. Well, guess what? The world was against God, but so was I, and he saved me, and I didn't deserve it. And I've heard people make this statement, and I've struggled with this. If you were the only person in the world that needed to be saved, and there was nobody else that needed to be saved, or there was nobody else in the world, would God have done that for you anyway? Well, I think that's what God did. I think God looked at the individual and said, "This is for you. This is for you. This is for you. This is for the 7+ billion people who are living on the face of the earth right now." And a lot of people will never hear that, and a lot of people will never comprehend that, and a lot of people will never know that. And so I think that's what I heard a preacher say years ago, that we are like conduits of God's grace, and God's grace needs to flow through everything we do and everything we say. And I think particularly as preachers, I see preachers who are arrogant and prideful and who couldn't give you a definition of humility because they've never experienced it in their life. But if you look at life, if you look at your life as a child of God, like God's grace is going to flow through me, and I'm going to be a conduit of God's grace to other people, that'll change your life. That'll change the way you look at every person in the world. And you look at every person in the world. I mean, I can see 5 people in here, and I don't know if any of them are Christians or not, but I believe that Jesus died for every one of them. And I've got to, that causes me to want to act with grace toward people. So, people say, "Well, I have a temper problem. I lose my cool." Well, figure out how to act with grace toward people when they get your order wrong, when they don't do what you want them to do. My biggest problem in the world is having grace toward people on I-35 when I'm driving on the interstate. At least they can't hear me, But if we, particularly those of us who preach the grace of God, and who ought to have some kind of grasp of God's understanding God's grace, we ought to live our lives with grace. It's not just something that we receive. It's not just something that we get. It's not just something that we have, but we have to be those people who dispense the grace of God toward other people. And that's one of the ways that a lot of people will learn about grace, because they're going to come hear a sermon, but they'll see how you act, and they'll know how you treat them, and if you're kind to them, and you extend grace to them. And one other thing about that, by the way, if I extend grace to somebody, it's only because I've come to understand something about what God has done for me. And anytime somebody extends grace, it'll be because they have some understanding of being a recipient of grace.
And that's most certainly a biblical concept, especially when it comes to things like there's lots of verses about like forgiveness, even as Christ forgave you, so you should do for others, like in Colossians 3 and things like that. I wanted to ask you, you said something that reminded me about this. I want to ask you if you would say that I'm on maybe the right track with this, or maybe going a little too far with this or not. And I know that I've been guilty of doing this before. I used to just talk about grace as the means to blessings. I need grace to get salvation. I need grace to go to heaven and things like that. But I now recognize that grace is my means to, if it's going to be a means to something, it's the means to me accomplishing the impossible, which is a relationship with the holy God as an unworthy sinner. And I deserve the worst that God could give me. And instead he offers the very best that he gives me. And that gives me so much internal desire to hate sin and to seek him more and more. And I know in the past I've thought about this, and a lot of Christians have agreed with this, that I've been guilty of going, yeah, I know God has grace and I'm saved by grace, or I know that God wants me to be comforted, and I know that God is going to take care of me. My situation is really difficult. And I've kind of yeah'd my way through a lot of the things that have been made possible to me because of God's grace. And grace reminds me that all those things that I'm going to, I shouldn't have any of those things because of who I am and what I've done. And I only have them because God chose to offer them to me. And it seems to me that to just those things, it's such an offense to the grace of God. And it seems to me to be so ungrateful for me to just normalize all these blessings that I have that are a result of the impossible being accomplished because of the grace of God in my life. Does that sound right to you? Does that sound accurate?
Marco, I think you're exactly right, and I really do believe that. I think you mentioned it's the key to the way that we can have a relationship with God. We have to make a choice that we want to have a relationship with God, but we could not initiate that relationship with God. God had to be the one who initiated that. All these things are from God. God is the one who decided that he wanted to have a relationship with us. Now, we can say no to that, of course. We don't have to, but if it's possible, it's not. It's like I've got a friend who's very wealthy, and if he said to me, I'm working on a project and I want us to be partners in this project, and this project is going to make us a lot of money. And so let's get together and talk about it, and we'll get this going. And I'm thinking, I don't have what I have to bring to the table, right? I mean, we're not going to. We might be partners, but if we are, it's because he allows us to be partners. Because I'm not going to be able to go to him and say, I've got this project in mind and it's going to cost $1 million, and I've got $1,000. Can you? That's not the way it works. And so if we're going to have a relationship with God, God is the one who has to initiate that. And he only makes that happen through the blood of Jesus. It's the only way that's going to happen.
Well, I want to ask you then, I illustrated it this way recently, and there is no perfect place to make this kind of an illustration, I think, than in the Sunday morning Bible class. I was discussing grace, and I said it would be like if LeBron James walked into the auditorium during Bible class and said, hey, look, I need to have a 5-on-5 game against the, let's say, the Dallas Mavericks. and I need to pick 4 people from this congregation. So I need the 4 oldest and most feeble people in this church to be part of my team. That is the most backwards way we could ever even choose a team. Instead, it makes more sense on the human level to say, he said, who are the 4 most athletic and fit people? Where's the youth group class? I got to go talk to them. But he comes and he says, no, in fact, everyone's welcome on the team, but I'll even take the most slow, the most feeble, the most elderly, people who had never played basketball and they're in their 90s. And his ability enough would be and just with their minimal participation and their complete lack of credentials, his ability is enough in this situation to take them to victory. Does that kind of sound like, again, there's no perfect way to boil down something so amazing, but does that sound like it's on the right track?
I think that's exactly what's right. And I think that's what I was trying to lead up to, that to have this relationship, we don't really bring anything to the table. Now we've got to have, you say we've got to have a desire, we've got to be willing to, but to make that happen, we don't really bring anything to the table.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I read an article years ago about John Havlicek. He was a great basketball player for the Boston Celtics years and years ago. And a guy was quoted after a game one night. He said, tonight, me and John Havlicek scored 68 points. And he said, I scored 2 and he scored 66. So I kind of think that's the way it is. Look, God uses us to do great things for him, and we're allowed to do great things for God, but it's not based upon our merit or our knowledge or even our creativity. It's all about what God has done. Now, there are people in the religious world and in the church who, again, go to another extreme and say, it's all grace. I don't do anything, which means I don't need to respond to it. I don't need to be baptized. I don't need to live. I can live any way I want to. God's going to take care of all of that. And that's in many ways it's dangerous, or maybe even more so than that other extreme. But it seems like that we would do well to learn, not just to have an understanding of a definition of grace and not just to know what God has done for us, but to be able to allow that to permeate our lives. I've mentioned that once or twice, but I want to come back to it one more time. To have a real understanding of grace means that I'm going to be a person of grace, and I'm going to live with grace. And when I hear a preacher, for instance, who's angry all the time, and he's ugly to other people, and he's unkind, and then he gets up in the pulpit, he becomes a different person, and he may even preach about grace. He doesn't understand grace, because if I did, I would live with grace. I would be a person who extends grace to other people. People would look at us and they'd say, "You're a gracious person," and our response ought to be, "I'm a gracious person because God has been so gracious to me." And so it's not just something that happens, that was an event that occurred, but it's got to become a life of grace, a lifestyle of grace. And the more that becomes a part of who we are, I think we'll even have a greater understanding of grace.
I have 2 quotes, one short and then one's from a song that we sing. I want to share with you as we start to wrap up here. One was from Focal Point, and you and I were both there this last year. Mike Vestal was preaching, and one thing that he said that I remember now that encapsulates something that you were saying just a little bit earlier, and with our purpose to glorify God in this life. You may remember in this lesson he said over and over again, "To us, grace; to him, glory." And he said it over and over again. To us, God gives grace, and to him we give glory. And it really hit home when I heard that, and I'm starting to understand it even more as I go on studying grace.
An understanding of grace means that we will be people who live with grace, and we are gracious people, and we extend grace to other people as well. So yes.
I appreciate you very much for taking the time, Jeff. I really, really do. Thank you.
Hey, it's been a pleasure to be with you, Marco, and I appreciate the invitation, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
I would love it. Yeah. God bless you. I really, again, I appreciate you, and I hope to do it again sometime soon. But thank you again.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. You too. Goodbye. Well, thank you again for being here for In Between Sundays. May God bless you. May you live in His grace each and every day. Take care. See you next time. Goodbye.